It's a pleasure to be here at the National Museum of the Pacific War, a museum that I admire very much. I'm here to tell you the story of Arthur Beaumont, my father, who was a noted naval artist for many years. Actually, his career of painting for the Navy spanned 45 years, but we'll get to that a little bit later. This is a portrait of my dad. It was done by Jean Appleby, and it's a very good likeness of him when he was in his mid-career. Now this is a picture of him when he was a schoolboy in England, at the age of 18. He'd finished his schooling at the secondary level, and he was faced with the dilemma of not being able to get into university in England because he was from a lower middle class family, and the access to the universities was for the upper class and for those that were financially well off. So my dad did not have the opportunity at the age of 18 to go on to college. When he was in the secondary school, he also was in a cavalry reserve corps, and he's in the middle of this picture, which was taken in 1907, and he's in the back row, and he's a cadet learning to be a cavalryman. That would hold him in good stead because in later years, he would become a cowboy in California to earn money to go back to art school. It took him a long time because he kept running out of money. So at the age of 18, he had to make a decision. What do I do? Where do I go? And he decided he wanted to follow in his brother's footsteps. His brother William, who was 4 years older, had run across the same problem when he was 18. He had solved the problem by going to the United States and enrolling at the University of California, Berkeley, as an engineering student. And while he was there, he wrote to my father, telling him the university was of very high quality, it was free, and the weather was better. So come on over. So my dad decided he was going to do that, and his father helped him to get a job in Saskatchewan. So he went by way of Canada to get to California, and he was to be a cowboy using his equestrian skills that he learned when he was in high school. So here he is as a cowboy. He is now 20 years old, and he has just enrolled at the University of California, taken his first semester in art school, and he ran out of money. So one of the officials of the university, who was the controller, had a client who was a very large ranch in Central California. It was called the Miller and Lux Ranch. And so the controller got him a job to work on the ranch, and he spent about a year there, between ages 19 and 20, learning the ropes of being a cowhand. In later years, he would also paint paintings of that experience. And this is done some years later, but it's an oil painting, a self-portrait of he with his horse Palladrino. Now, in the process of working for the Miller and Lux Ranch, his responsibilities were to monitor the inventories that they had on the ranch of various supplies. And he found out that some of his ranch hands were stealing supplies, and they were taking those supplies to a saloon owned by an Italian family in the town of Firebaugh. And so he went into Firebaugh to challenge the people who were stealing the goods, and they attacked him. And a group of 8 Italian husky men attacked him all at the same time. And he fought very hard, but in fact he was quite seriously injured, and he had to go ultimately to the hospital for repairs before he went back to the University of California and the art school. Well, along the way, he finally finished his studies at Berkeley, and he decided that because the Italians had sworn a vendetta against him, that he needed to leave the area and change his name. I might back up and say his name originally, he was born Arthur Crabbe. But he was hiding from these this Italian gang under threat of being seriously injured. He changed his name to Arthur Beaumont. And so I'm lucky today I'm the beneficiary of that change. So he decided to leave the area also. He went down to Los Angeles, and there he took a job as a construction worker at the Bible Institute. And at the Bible Institute, my mother was working over the Christmas holidays. She was 17 years old. She was working in the bookstore, and they met in the cafeteria. So here's my mother at age 17. It's Dorothy Dean, ultimately Dorothy Dean Beaumont. And she fell in love with my dad, but my grandfather did not approve. So my grandfather said, "No, you're an itinerant worker who wants to be an artist. This is not good enough for my only daughter." So my dad had to prove his worth to him, and he had to get a job. So he got a job with the Southern Pacific Railroad, and he was able to bring home a check on a regular basis. And that satisfied my grandfather. And ultimately, when she was 21, they were married, and their marriage lasted for the rest of their lives. In the mid-1920s, my father also went to Chenard Art Institute. It was a spin-off from the Otis Art Institute, and it became the leading school for modernists. And my dad learned there, graduated from there, and ultimately taught there. But in 1925, when he graduated, Mrs. Chenard arranged for him to have a scholarship to go back to Europe. So he was able to travel, leaving my mother behind with two children now, two babies. He went to England and studied at the Slade School of Art at the University of London. And of course, this was very comfortable for him because he was English by birth, and he was able to see his mother when he was back in England. But after Slade, he decided, well, I'm in Europe, and I've been to Paris, and Paris is really the center of art at this moment, mid-1920s. So I am going to go to a Paris School of Art, and he went to the Académie Julienne. This is a sketch of the front door of the Académie Julienne. He's labeled it in the bottom, and this is in 1925 and 1926. This is a self-portrait that he did of himself that year when he was a student in Europe. And here is a picture of him in Paris in front of the Notre Dame, which we all know was seriously damaged in a fire, almost destroyed in a fire not long ago, and it's being rebuilt as we speak. So he went and finished his work at the Académie Julienne, went back to California, and was hired by Mrs. Chenard to teach drawing, composition at the Chenard Art Institute. He did that from 1926 until 1929, and in 1929, he decided to leave Chenard Art Institute to go out on his own and set up his own studio in August of 1929 in downtown Los Angeles. By now he was a graduate student, and he was getting commissions to do some commercial art, and he was painting art on his own and giving classes as well. Well, he opened his studio in August of 1929, and in October of 29, the stock market crashed. And it wiped out the art market, disappeared. You could not sell a painting to save your soul. Disposable income disappeared, and it was a very grave period of time for the United States as we went into the Depression, and the Depression was worldwide. So, but at that time, it was paintings in the French style. Now, this is a painting called Little Mother, and it's my sister Phyllis at the age of 7. And she's not holding a baby, she's holding a baby doll. So she's pretending to be a mother. But it's painted very much in the French style, which was characteristic of his early works. It's also in oil, whereas later on he became primarily a watercolorist. So here are the type of paintings he was painting. as a California impressionist. And that became very important to him because he knew most of the artists who were continuing to make paintings during that time, but practically none of them were sold. So here you have a painting that looks very much like a William Blent, and here you have a mountain scene that looks very much like an Edgar Payne. And he also taught in the harbor. He loved to paint fishing boats because they were very colorful and complicated compositions. And so to earn money during this terrible period, he was now out of work because his studio had to close in March of 1930, and he's back to teaching and looking for a job. Now at that time, my mother plays a very important part in his career. My mother, who had graduated as the first woman valedictorian of UCLA, when she graduated, she was hired as assistant dean of women, and she was in a position of authority at UCLA. And so she saw that my father needed a little bit of help, and she got him appointed as the illustrator for all of UCLA publications in 1930. So here he had his only job offer was a part-time work at the same institution where my mother was working. And he was also giving these lessons down to students to earn out some money from a separate source in the harbor. And he's also migrated to painting watercolors. But in 1930, my mother got him another commission. My mother was a very good friend of the bishop of the city of Los Angeles, the Episcopal Bishop, Church of England. And the Church of England was in charge of a mission church in Point Hope, Alaska. Mission church, which was primarily attended by Inuit natives. And he was commissioned to do the altarpiece for the church in Alaska because the church was graduating from being a mission church to being a parish. And the Diocese of Los Angeles wanted to commemorate that event with a gift. So the gift was this painting, the only religious painting my father ever painted, and it is a painting of Doubting Thomas. That is St. Thomas in the foreground, and Christ is showing him his wounds. Now this painting is done in the style of Georges de Latour, the French artist that Beau had studied when he was in Paris. And it shows the internal luminosity radiating to light up the scene and to focus on Christ in the center. This is now, continues to be, the altarpiece at the St. Thomas Church in Point Hope, Alaska. So years later, I took my grandson, and he and I flew up to Point Hope, Alaska, and I took this photograph of the painting. It was quite an interesting experience because the city of Point Hope, the town of Point Hope, was primarily a whaling town, and there were 850 residents, and 550 of those residents were Episcopalian. So it was a pretty large church for a very small town. But I got a chance to see this in situ with my grandson when he was 6 years old. But back to the time when Beau was an illustrator for UCLA. In 1931, UCLA was named as a sponsor of the Olympic Games, which would be held in Los Angeles in 1932. So here's a picture of the posters that he did. He did all the posters for the Olympic Games for UCLA. And this is a poster of London. He did 9 posters, and they were all of cities that had hosted the Olympic Games over in 1932. This is my favorite poster. This is a poster of Paris. And of course, it's done in the Art Nouveau style that was prominent in the early 1930s. Now, in 1931, my dad had the good fortune to meet Captain Percy Foote. Captain Foote was a captain of a battleship in the harbor at Long Beach, and Captain Foote was an art collector, and he went to see one of Beau's shows. He liked the work, quality of work, and he asked Beau if he would do a I'm using the word Beau now, which is the nickname my father became. Everyone called him Beau. So in 1931, he chose to do a portrait of Admiral Percy Foote, and here it is, the portrait being done. This is in the cabin, the captain's cabin, on board the battleship Arkansas. And you can see there, it's very formal. My dad did not work from photographs ever, so the captain had to sit there for hours while my dad was doing the portrait, and also studying the personality of the person that he was portraying in the portrait. Well, this led to a very good sequence of events where Captain Percy Foote invited him to go on board the battleship at sea, and they had went on battle maneuvers in 1931, and those maneuvers ended with the ships all going from Long Beach into San Diego Harbor. In San Diego Harbor, the scouting force was there. It was commanded by another admiral, and that admiral was Admiral William Leahy. Admiral Leahy in later years would become the highest ranking officer in World War II and was the first five-star admiral of the US Navy. But in 1931, he saw the portrait by Captain Foote, and he said, I would like to have a portrait also. So my dad did his first portrait of Admiral Leahy. Now here's a picture of the city of Long Beach. It's done in later years, but the tower on the left is the Villa Riviera Hotel, and that is where Admiral Leahy and his wife lived when he was in residence as Battle Fleet Commander in Long Beach. And the building on the right is the Pacific Coast Club, and on top of the Pacific, it's sort of in the style of a Norman castle. It's a high-rise building, but like a castle. On top of that is a penthouse owned by the Hathaway family, and they offered that to him as his studio. So Admiral Leahy lives next door, and Beau both lived and worked in the Pacific Coast Club next door. Now here's a hand-done pencil portrait, one of the studies he did. He would do several studies of Admiral Leahy. And here's Admiral Leahy, a portrait painted in later years. At this time, he is now a full admiral, and he is Chief of Naval Operations, the highest rank for an operating officer. In later years, President Roosevelt would, after retirement, would bring him back into public service, and he became the Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief, and his office during the war years was in the White House with President Roosevelt. But backing up now to the time when Admiral Leahy saw the talent that Beau had, and he offered him a commission in the US Navy and said, how would you like to be the artist of the US fleet? And that had great appeal. My dad could finally have a full-time job, and he was given a uniform as a lieutenant, even though he did no training as such. And he was, here you see him with his sketchbook. He's on board a cruiser, and then in the background is the Indianapolis, which was Roosevelt's flagship in 1934 at the Fleet Review in New York Harbor. And my dad was there doing his studies, and we in fact met President Roosevelt on board the Indianapolis. Here's a picture of Beau in the harbor painting the Indianapolis. Again, he always worked from sketches, not from photographs. There he is at work, and here's a sketch, one of the working sketches. And here is the painting of the Indianapolis. In this case, the yacht in the foreground is President Roosevelt's yacht. And this painting was presented to President Roosevelt aboard the Indianapolis in 1934. We thought that this later years, Indianapolis was sunk in a very tragic event, and many of its crew were lost under terrible circumstances, attacked by sharks. But this ship, in 1945, was the ship that carried the atomic bomb from Oakland to Kwajalein, and then was transshipped to Tinian, where it was put on board the Enola Gay, and ultimately dropped the bomb on Hiroshima to end the war on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it was a very important ship, but ill-fated. But we thought this painting was lost when the ship was sunk 2 weeks after it delivered the bomb to Kwajalein. And in fact, the painting had been taken off the ship, was in Hawaii, and I found it 40 years after the end of the war in an Admiral's office at the submarine base in Hawaii. And this was now returned to the National Collection and is in Washington, D.C., and it's in this show. Now, President Roosevelt was also a fan of my dad's. This is President Roosevelt's, that's his bedroom, where he lived at his mother's house at Hyde Park. And if you look on the upper right, there's an image of a ship, and that ship is the Tuscaloosa. And this image is now permanently in President Roosevelt's bedroom. And it was a gift from Admiral Leahy to President Roosevelt. So now back to 1932, Beau goes to sea with the Navy, and he starts to paint all the ships. Here's a picture of the Saratoga. If you look carefully, it's launching biplanes from an aircraft carrier. Most people have never have seen that. In the background, you'll see an escort ship, which is a destroyer. It has 4 stacks, and that means that destroyer was burning coal, not oil. The Navy was in transition in the 1930s, retiring the ships that were doing coal and replacing them with all the ships that burned oil. So in World War II, they all burned oil. In 1933, the Constitution in Boston had been restored, and there'd been a national campaign for children to raise money to do the restoration. So to reward people around the country for having given money to do the restoration of the ship, the Constitution was towed to all of the major ports in the United States, including coming through the Panama Canal to Long Beach, to San Diego and Long Beach. So my dad, this was a big event. He was now the Navy artist, and he had to paint the Constitution. So here's a picture of one of the paintings he did of the Constitution. In this case, it was an oil painting. And here he is delivering the painting to the retiring Secretary of the Navy on board the Constitution in California. This is done in San Francisco Harbor. And in the background is the mayor of San Francisco in a top hat, if you can see him. And hundreds of thousands of people went on board the ship. It was a very big event. And here's a picture of the Constitution when it was in Long Beach Harbor. And it's passing in review of the battleships which were stationed in Long Beach. But Beau went on to paint all of the other capital ships of the U.S. Navy. And here's a painting of the USS Ranger, which was one of the earliest of our aircraft carriers, coming through the Panama Canal. I particularly like this composition because you get a tropical scene and a Navy ship at the same time, which is pretty rare. Beau also did posters for the Navy. These were recruiting posters. Here's a picture of President Teddy Roosevelt, a battleship in the background. And this was typical of the things that were used to recruit new sailors for the Navy. He went on to paint multiple paintings of the Navy in action. And in 1934, he decided that he was getting a lot of commissions from high-ranking naval officers who wanted to have paintings to own themselves that were not owned by the Navy. Because as an officer in the Navy, all the paintings he did were owned by the Navy. Just as a photographer the images would be owned by the Navy as well. So he decided to resign his regular commission and go into the California Naval Guard. And in the California Naval Guard, he could be a reservist, and he could be freelance, and he could sell paintings to these high-ranking officers who wanted pictures of the ship. And it became de rigueur, but basically every captain in the Navy that was the captain of a major ship wanted a Beaumont painting. He was the go-to guy, and he kept his prices very reasonable so that they could afford them to buy them during the Depression. But in the course of going to the California Naval Guard, one of the other participants of that unit he was in was John Ford. And John Ford was a famous movie producer. This is a picture of John Ford's yacht, the Mariner. And John Ford was noted for doing some of the most important movies, including the John Wayne movies. He was very famous at the time as a director, and my dad met John Wayne, of course, at the same time, and ultimately did a portrait of the yacht of John Wayne, the Wild Goose, and as he did the Mariner here. Now, the Mariner, when John Ford was between movies, he would go on board this boat and he would just drink a lot. He was just noted for being a very talented producer and director, but also a drunkard. And my dad was one of his drinking buddies, but not that much. But he would continue to paint his paintings in the harbor. John Ford introduced my dad to other major movie producers, and my dad was hired to do the artwork for the movie Mutiny on the Bounty. So here's a picture of my dad on board the deck of the Bounty, the replica made by the studio. And in the picture is Clark Gable, dressed as Fletcher Christian, and that is Edith Head, who designed the costumes. And there's Beau with his sketchbook and typical English outfit, wearing a tie, a sweater, and a hat. And that movie went on to win the Academy Award in 1935. Became very famous. So Beau was still going to sea, and he was painting all the major ships in the U.S. Navy, and he was also doing portraits of high-ranking officers. In this case, this is a Marine Corps colonel, Colonel Underwood. Ultimately, he became a lieutenant general in World War II, was one of the ranking Marines in the Pacific War. So more images that were done in the 1930s. Here's a picture of the battleship Oklahoma. Now, I owned this painting. I inherited it from my father, and I wanted to give a gift to the Arizona Memorial because they were building a collection of Beaumonts there. And my dad had made a notation on the back of this painting that it was of the Arizona. So I made the gift to the Arizona Memorial. And 2 weeks later, the historian called me. He said, by the way, the painting you gave us is not the Arizona. It's the sister ship of the Arizona. It's the Oklahoma. And I said, oh my gosh, I thought I was giving you the Arizona. And he said, well, we are delighted to have this because we have many paintings of the Arizona, but we only have one painting of the Oklahoma, and this is it. So this resides now in their collection. It typically, when it's not on display to the public, because it is a watercolor, it has to be protected. It's in the office of the director of the museum. But here, in fact, from the same period, this is a painting of the Arizona, painted in 1935, at a time when my father went cruising on board the Arizona with Admiral Nimitz, who at that time was a captain. And my dad became a good friend of Admiral Nimitz. That's one of the reasons I'm here today, and we have brought the collection here, because they were good friends. And a little known fact, but Admiral Nimitz's wife was an art student of my dad's. And that was the bond. That's how we met Admiral Nimitz. In any case, this is the real thing. This is the Arizona. In the late 1930s, the war broke out in Europe. The Germans attacked Poland, and they were trying to take over all of Europe. My dad had met through his motion picture connections. He'd met Marion Davies, who was the paramour of William Randolph Hearst. So Hearst became aware of my dad's talents and hired my dad to do images for the Hearst Syndicate of newspapers. Now these are ink paintings, which is quite unusual. They're in black and white because they're going to be photographed and they're going to be on the cover of the Hearst newspaper syndicate the next day. In this case, it's a painting of two German ships at sea that were threatening the British Navy. Now this is before Pearl Harbor, and Europe is at war, but the America is isolationist at that time and was trying to stay out of the war because our casualties in World War I had been so severe, they didn't want to repeat that experience. But in fact, the Nazis were overtaking almost all of Europe at the same time as the Japanese were invading China. And so my dad was very conscious of the war in Europe, and he did 125 of these ink drawings over a 2-year period. And these images appeared in the Hearst Syndicate newspapers. Here's another image. This is a painting of the battleship Hood. This is the English battleship. And she is going out, departing from another. You can see the sailors on the other ship are waving goodbye, but she's going out and she's going to be confronted by the German battleship Bismarck. And the Bismarck, in that encounter, sank the Hood, which was the largest ship in the British Navy, and with almost complete loss of life. Approximately 1,800 men were lost with the downing of that ship. So this was a very powerful image. Then from these images, the National Geographic magazine spotted Beau's talent, and that he was very good at doing military subjects. And they retained him to do a series of army paintings of the National Geographic, to be published in the National Geographic. So here's a painting of it's the cruiser Astoria, and this was done for the National Geographic. Now here is a picture of me with one of the working drawings. So you can see the finished painting is on the right and the working drawing is on the left. But the working drawing is smaller and it's in great detail. It's a wonderful painting in its own right. But one of my father's collectors came up with this painting. I'd never seen it before. And it's very interesting because in the working drawing, there's only one ship, but in the final drawing, there are 2 ships, one in the background to give contrast and depth to composition. So my dad did 9 paintings for the National Geographic. Here's one of the flying boats. Here's one of destroyers, always with a very rough sea. Destroyers jumping out of the water there, you can see. Here are the support ships. This is a tanker, and submarines, and the last one is aircraft carriers. It isn't the last one, actually. The last one is the battleship Maryland, and this is the cover of the book that I wrote, The Art of the Sea, published by the Irvine Museum, which is in the bookstore here if you'd like to get a copy of it. It's in both hardback and softback. So there were several Army officers on the board of the National Geographic, and there was inter-service rivalry. And you had General John Pershing, who was the head of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I in Europe, and he was on board of the National Geographic. And the other general was the head of the Army Air Corps. Those 2 generals lobbied the National Geographic that you've done a series for the Navy, which was published in September of 1941, before Pearl Harbor. How about a series for the Army? And we'd like the series to be larger than the Navy series. So there were 9 inter-service rivalry. There were 9 paintings done for the Navy, and there were 16 paintings done for the Army. So here's a picture of my dad. This is the week before Pearl Harbor. He's painting during Army maneuvers in the Southeast. The Army was having live action maneuvers, and during this time, he also met General Patton, another famous name on the Army side of the equation from World War II. And Patton was so impressed with his skills as an artist. Here he is, he's learning the Army equipment because he only knew Navy equipment. So he does sketches of all the Army equipment, and it ends up in doing a painting like this of Army artillery. So Patton was so impressed with his skill that he called Washington and got the head of Army Public Relations to make an offer to Beau to become the official artist of the U.S. Army. The problem was he was already the official artist of the U.S. Navy. But the Army offered to make him a major and then promote him to colonel. In the Navy, he was a lieutenant. So he's really having a problem with, on December 6th, he wrote a letter to my mother, and I had the letter. And he's on a steamship going from Norfolk, Virginia, back to Washington, D.C. to arrive on the the morning of December 7th in Washington to deliver his Army drawings to the National Geographic for approval to be made into paintings, to final paintings. And so he arrives in Washington, D.C. in the morning of December 7th. My brother is there working for the cartography department of the National Geographic, and they go to church in Washington, D.C. at the National Cathedral, which was an Episcopalian cathedral, and they come out afterwards and they have lunch. And they leave lunch a little bit after 2 o'clock, and they walk outside and they notice that there are taxi cabs that are pulled over to the side of the road, and there are little clusters of people around the cabs, but the taxi cabs have the radios, and the attack in Hawaii is on. And that was the first he learned that the Japanese had attacked in Pearl Harbor. So he went on to complete his Army series, and here's one of my favorites. These are the ski troops. Here you get kind of a twofer because you get a landscape and you get soldiers in the foreground in what I think is one of the most beautiful paintings in the Army series. He also was hired at that time to do publicity in motion pictures. And there was a motion picture that was made very early in the one by his producer friend. And it was the movie Wake Island. So here's a picture of one of the Marine Corps dive bombers attacking a Japanese ship. But in fact, we lost the battle, and Wake Island was captured by the Japanese the week after Pearl Harbor. Now, to retaliate against the Japanese for the attack on Pearl Harbor, we were devastated by the attack. There was a lot of speculation as to why our ships were in the harbor that day, but the lucky part of it was none of our carriers were in port, and that would become very important later on in the Battle of Midway when we were able to turn the tide of the war with those extra carriers. But in the meantime, we decided we needed to have an attack on the Japanese territory. So General Doolittle, who was then a colonel, organized the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. So here you have a photograph of the Army planes on board the Navy carrier. It's the Wasp and the Hornet. And the Army planes were about to launch to attack Tokyo. Unfortunately, the fleet was discovered by some Japanese fishing boats prematurely, so they had to launch the planes sooner than they wanted, and they knew the planes would just barely have enough fuel to make it all the way to China to land, but not very many planes were able to do that. So here is a picture of the aircraft carrier launching the Doolittle raid. It was pretty rough weather, and here's a painting that Beau did to commemorate the Doolittle raid. And you can see he was not there, but he had already painted the ships when they were in the harbor. He had sketches of them, so he was able to put together this composition from that. Beau also was hired by the Navy to help raise money by selling war bonds. He would do lithographs, and they would be given to people who bought substantial war bonds, helping the war effort. Here he is signing one of those lithographs. He also did billboards for the Navy, join the Navy and see the world. Well, that was very successful. People were very patriotic at that time, and they were volunteering. And here is, later on, a battle scene. This is at Okinawa. Now, my dad was not allowed to go into a battle zone by Admiral Leahy, because he was considered to be a very valuable part of Navy intelligence and publicity. But so all of his scenes that were done were not witnessed in person, but he had already done the sketches of the ship. But here you have a particularly interesting one because there's an air battle going on also. And you'll see kamikazes trying to hit the ships at Okinawa. And they did sink many ships. It was some of our worst casualties at that time. But Beau also painted almost all of the types of ships during the war. You can see this ship is a cargo ship, but it is armored and it is also camouflaged. And here you have jeep carriers that were protecting the amphibious invasions in the Philippines. And here you had battle scenes of ships at sea. And this is a picture of My ship, I served on board this ship for 2 years after the war, but it was commissioned during the war and served in the Pacific, in the battle zone. Here's a picture of a cruiser and another picture of a destroyer. And this is a picture of Admiral Burke, Arleigh Burke, who became a very important admiral in the Navy in post-war years. This was his flagship of the Little Beavers. At the end of the war, Beau was in Cuba, he was in Guantanamo Bay, and the USS Midway, our first supercarrier, was being commissioned as a new ship. It did not see action in World War II. It saw action only in the Korean War later. But this is a picture of the Midway done in 1945 at the very end of the war. So these are the ships coming home from the war. And in 1946, the Navy decided it needed to have a test of the atomic bomb because he realized it was a threat to the fleet. So they organized the Bikini atomic bomb tests in 1945, 1946. And here's a picture of the atomic bomb being dropped on the guinea pig fleet in the Bikini Atoll. So we took our old ships and we dropped a bomb on them to test what the amount of damage was. So this is a photograph of the first able bomb. If you know the history of the bomb, the first bomb was Alamogordo, New Mexico. And the question was, does the bomb work? The answer was, it does. The second bomb was Hiroshima. The third bomb was Nagasaki. And that was the end of the war. So after 1946, the fourth and fifth bombs were here at Bikini, and this is the fourth bomb, about 9 months after the end of the war. Here's a painting done by Beau on the flagship. He's on the deck of the bridge of the flagship, looking at the atomic bomb and doing his images of it. Again, he was very quick in doing his sketches, and he would do the paintings at night in his studio on board the flagship. Here's a picture of the second bomb, which is underwater bomb. First bomb was dropped from the air, second bomb was underwater. And my dad always said that his painting had the only true colors because the flash, the white flash of the bomb caused the light meters to go crazy, and the photographs lost the color. So he's saying this is the only true color of what it looked like. And he did that painting the day after the bomb was done. Here he is after the first bomb, before the second bomb, doing his sketches of the ships that had been damaged during the first bomb. And his boatman forgot him. He was supposed to be there only for 45 minutes because of the radioactivity. In fact, he was there for 4 hours, and he became contaminated by radioactivity. Unluckily, he was discovered when he got back to the flagship. He was treated for it by given a very tough scrub down and shower, and he never got cancer, and he lived to be almost 88 years old. But many of the people that were there at Bikini did react to the radioactivity. Here's a picture between the first bomb and the second bomb of the ships that have been damaged. Now, these ships were not that close together, but for security reasons, my dad had to bring them close together. The positions are correct, but they were spread out over a much larger area. This is a picture of the ship going down in the foreground, and also that's the Nevada that was painted red. Now, there was a rivalry between the Air Force and the Navy. The Army Air Force was dropping the bomb, so the Navy wanted to make sure that they dropped it on the target, so they painted the target ship red. The rest of the ships were gray. And unfortunately, the Army Air Corps missed the target and sank a ship 2,000 yards away, and the target ship, Nevada, survives the attack. You can see the other ships around it are sinking. Here's a picture of night. Well, this is a wonderful night shot of the burning ship in the background and the Nevada in the foreground. The damage to the ships was very substantial, and the Navy actually altered its strategy and began to build up the submarine corps to be able to defend against the atomic weapons. Here's the Japanese battleship that was the flagship at the attack on Pearl Harbor, being sunk at Bikini. And here's a picture of the USS Skate. This was a submarine. It was on the surface when the bomb was dropped, but it was the superstructure was damaged. But the crew went back on board, and they got underway, and they paraded this in front of the flagship to show the admiral that they could still run the ship. The problem was it was radioactive, and those sailors exposed themselves very seriously to too much contamination. I don't know how they were tracked afterwards, but unlike my dad, some of them probably didn't make it. Here's a picture of the aircraft carrier Saratoga sinking, and here's another version of it in its final death throes. That was our third aircraft carrier in the fleet made during the 1930s. In the post-war years, my dad wanted to travel with the Navy. He's now a civilian, but the Navy gives him permission to go on cruises anytime he wants, and he's still painting Navy vessels. Here's a painting done in China with the Navy ship Helena, and here's a picture with the Admiral on board the flagship en route to China. When he went to China, he studied the Chinese scroll painters, and his techniques changed. Here he did a scene of the Temple of Heaven in the Forbidden City in Beijing. And here's one of his pictures of Chinese junks on the Yangtze River. This was a particular favorite of mine. He gave this to me as a wedding gift. So I've given this now to my daughter. But I love the Chinese. You can see how fluid the watercolor style is. It's quite different from his Navy paintings. It's calm, and the palette is different. It's softer, and it has more tones towards the red. Here's another one done in Hong Kong harbor of the Chinese junks. And here he is on board the ship giving a demonstration lecture to the crew. He would go down to the mess decks and set up his easel and give them a demonstration painting. After the war, he also was commissioned to do a couple of murals. And here he is doing a mural for the Jonathan Club in Los Angeles. It's an oil mural. It's almost life-size. And in the foreground on the left, is my nephew, John, who was the only one in the family who was able to adopt my dad's style and became a very accomplished artist in his own right. And here's a color picture of the mural. It's Korea to discovering California. In the early 1950s, the Navy has changed its strategy and is focusing on building submarines and ultimately nuclear submarines. So the first nuclear submarine was the USS Nautilus, and the Nautilus was built in 1954. And here's a picture of the Nautilus up on the ways, about to be launched. And this painting ultimately was given to Mamie Eisenhower, who was the sponsor of the boat, and she christened it. And this painting ultimately went with her to the White House. And then when she and President Roosevelt retired, she gave the painting to the Nautilus Museum, and it went back to the submarine base in Connecticut. And ultimately it ended up in the collection that is the Nautilus Museum today. My dad also was commissioned in the late 1959, 57 to 59, to paint in the Arctic. So here's one of his Arctic paintings. Now here you have gone from the tropics in Bikini, where it's 115 degrees, to here it might be 10 degrees below zero. So the question is, he was painting watercolors. How do you do watercolors when it's that cold? And the answer was he worked out a formula that if you put 35% alcohol with the watercolor wash, you would be able to, the paint would flow through the brush without crystallizing, and he could do a painting at 10 degrees below zero. And we have pictures, I'll show you shortly after this, a painting of him painting on the ice, real plein air. But these are the paintings from initially the Arctic. They're quite atmospheric, and he loved icebreakers. he thought they were like sculptures. So you can see it's a very impressionistic and fluid style when he paints the icebreakers. And here's my favorite photograph. There he is painting a watercolor at 10 degrees below zero on the ice. He's sitting on the ice. Here's another picture of that's his ship, the Glacier, an icebreaker. And in the background is the tallest mountain in Antarctica. It's Mount Erebus, and it's a volcano. You'll see it smoking at the top. It's one of my favorite paintings because you get another twofer. You get a landscape and a ship at the same time. Pretty rare. The ship, of course, is cutting through the ice field. Here's a picture of a ship that they rescued. They got caught in the ice. It was a British expedition, and the icebreaker had to go and go around it and free it from the ice. And here's a picture of the penguins on the ice. And he was also, while he was there, he flew from McMurdo Sound, the Navy base, all the way to the South Pole. And he, in fact, painted the South Pole. So here is the pole at the South Pole. And we have a radar station there. The base itself is underground to protect so they can heat it up. So he went on to paint ship portraits, all the most important ships in the Navy. This is the Wisconsin, one of 4 battleships of this class, the Iowa class. Here he is doing a sketch on board this heavy cruiser. And he painted all the major capital ships in the Navy for the whole history of his 45 years. In 1961, of course, President John F. Kennedy was inaugurated. And the Navy group at the Army-Navy Club in Los Angeles wanted to give a gift to President Kennedy for the inauguration. The governor of California was a member of the Army-Navy group. He'd been in the Army-Navy Reserve, and he approached the group about giving a painting as the gift. And this was a gift from the Army-Navy group from the state of California, presented to President Kennedy at his inauguration. This painting ultimately was called Speed Run. It's the USS Rochester, and it went to the White House at the time, and it today resides at the Kennedy Museum in Boston. Now, I wanted to show you a picture of my dad in his later years in his studio, because it gives you an idea of how he did his paintings. Here you have a painting of the carrier John F. Kennedy, and in the foreground is the destroyer Joseph Kennedy. Now, these two ships never operated together, but in this painting, my father put them together because it was a painting that was going to go to the White House. So you can see here the two ships together, but you can see the painting, he's done the background paint first, then he's done the hulls of the ships, and he's about to fill in the last part, which is the ocean between the two, and you end up with this final painting. You can see how complicated it is. Again, these ships would not, it's artistic license. My dad would put the ships much too close together. They would never operate this close together, but for dramatic effect, he wanted the two paintings to be shown at the same time. In the background, you have another destroyer. Here's a picture of the USS England. This painting was given by my brother to Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth, and this resides in the Royal Collection in London today. And here's a picture of the USS Scamp. And we have in the audience today over here a friend of mine who served on board the USS Scamp, and he's the owner of this painting. But this was, my dad did not think that submarines were all that interesting. They were they were just too simple. So he would mostly do his paintings of submarines, in this case a nuclear submarine, in a harbor, because he could put in more interesting things around it. He also did civilian ships. Here's a picture of the Queen Mary. It's the last voyage of the Queen Mary. In the background, you'll see on the left a nuclear cruiser, which is the cruiser Long Beach. And he did his sketches of the Queen Mary from the bridge of that cruiser, and then went back to the studio and created this work. This is the only painting I ever bought from my dad, because I couldn't get it, break him away from the Navy. So I said, you've got to do the Queen Mary, because that's a big event in the history of Long Beach. So he finally did this, and he took almost a year to do it. And when he delivered it to me, gave it to me at a birthday party, and it was on a an easel, and it was covered up. And then he unveiled it and showed it to me for the first time. And he said, "Son, this was the most difficult painting I ever had to paint, because the Queen Mary has more portholes than any other ship in history. And if you look at it," he said, "they're all there." But if you look at this is a painting that's only about this large. If you look at the detail work on it, this is a watercolor. It's an extremely complicated painting to do. My dad also did paintings of the training ship USS Eagle. This is the Coast Guard ship Eagle. It's not USS, it's US Coast Guard ship, USGS Eagle. This is a training ship that exists today. And my dad had been a friend for over the years of Walt Disney. When he was a student at Chouinard Art Institute, Disney had wanted to hire him as a cartoonist. And just a side footnote, but my dad's love letters to my mother were all cartoons. And we have those in the family collection. But he was an accomplished cartoonist, and Walt Disney found that out and wanted him to become one of his earliest artists. But my dad decided to stay in fine art, and then of course got discovered by the Navy. But he always kept up his friendship with Walt Disney. So here's a picture of Walt Disney in his later years, just before he died, with my dad and the captain of the Eagle on board the deck of the Eagle, because they went to sea. And this is the resulting painting that occurred from that meeting. You can see in the background there's an escort ship. So my dad flew down to Miramar, the air base, Navy air base, in Walt Disney's plane. My dad went with him from Los Angeles to Miramar. And then they took a helicopter, went out to the escort ship, and then the Eagle was waiting for them without the sails up, dead in the water. They went by a small boat to the Eagle to then go on board the Eagle to have the photograph that you saw here. So that's how they got on board the Eagle. But these paintings of the Eagle were done in my dad's studio. And he then became enamored with the idea of going back in his history and painting a whole series of Revolutionary War sailing ships. So and these are watercolors again, not oils. So there's practically no other artist that I know of that was able to do this. And he painted the series. This was leading up to the bicentennial celebration, the Navy's bicentennial celebration. And in the end, he painted all the ships that had been in the Revolutionary War or the War of 1812. And these were publicized widely in the United States by various publications. In late 1960s, my father is now in his 70s. He's 79 years old in 1969, when the Navy offers him the opportunity to go on a secret mission. And the secret mission was to go to Vietnam and paint on the scene in Vietnam. So here's a picture that resulted from that series. This is an American ship interdicting the ships that were carrying supplies to the Viet Cong. And here's a picture of the river boats that patrolled at that time. And here's a picture of the nuclear carrier that was there at that time as well. This is a picture of the Enterprise, which was the first nuclear carrier. But my dad's trip to Vietnam was a secret trip because for publicity reasons, they didn't want anyone to be able to attack him. Admiral Leahy was no longer around, so he was able to go into a battle zone for the first time. But he was highly guarded, and those paintings resulted from that. So at the very end, he did the USS Enterprise, and you've seen before the last voyage of the Queen Mary. And here's a picture of my dad at his final exhibition, which was in Laguna Beach, the retrospective, and that is me when I was a younger man. Very, very proud of that photograph. My dad passed away a couple of years after that at the age of 87. And that concludes my speech on Arthur Beaumont and the Art of the Sea. Thank you very much.